In 1969, the Rolling Stones didn't just tour America, they collided with it. With their album Let It Bleed, the loss of Brian Jones, and A Country on Edge, the Stones hit the road at their most dangerous. What followed redefined live rock and ended in one of the most infamous concerts in music history. A deep dive into the Rolling Stones' 1969 U.S. tour coming up next.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock. This is the podcast for those about to read and rock. And what a great read this is. It's a brand new book on the Rolling Stones. Is everybody ready for the next band, the Rolling Stones 1969 U.S. tour? Our guest is the author of that book, Richard Houghton. First-time guest to the show. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Eric, thank you very much. Great to be here.
November 1969, the Stones toured the U.S. for the first time in 3 years. Before we get to that tour, let's start with the state of the Stones going back to June of that year. They had been away for a few years. There was some turbulence during those years, and there was still some ahead in terms of Brian Jones. Talk about that and where the Stones are at that point.
Well, obviously, the Stones had been off the road since the spring of 1967, where they'd done a short European tour. 67 was kind of the end of the Stones as a hit singles band. So you still got riots, screaming girls, stage invasions, and in Europe in particular, very aggressive police interaction with the crowd where they'd baton charge people and stuff like that. And then the Stones stopped touring. Like the Beatles, they became more of a studio band. You had the whole LSD experimentation with drugs thing that bands were getting into. So the Stones put out the Between the Buttons album, and then they put out their Satanic Majesty's Request, which was a long way away from where they started out as a blues and R&B band back in 1962. The main casualty of that experimentation, if you want to call it that, with drugs was Brian Jones, the band's founder. Brian was quite a vulnerable person, psychologically, emotionally. So although he was the creative genius in the band, he maybe wasn't as robust mentally. And not only did drugs not work well for him because he had bad acid trips, but his relationship with Anita Pallenberg, who was his girlfriend at the time, broke down. Anita famously started going out with Keith instead, Keith Richards. And although the band recorded the Beggars Banquet album in 1968, which was a move into their new phase as a blues-based rock band for the modern era, Brian wasn't a significant contributor to that album. And by the summer of 1969, with Beggars Banquet having been successful, with Let It Bleed recording sessions having started for the follow-up album, the Stones were ready to tour, but they knew that they weren't ready to tour with Brian because he was psychologically frail, but more critically, he'd had several arrests in London and therefore had convictions, and the Stones knew that he would not get a US visa, so they couldn't tour the US with Brian in the lineup, and they didn't think he was actually capable of doing it. So in the spring of that year, they went and talked to Brian at his home at Cochford Farm in Sussex in England, told him they wanted him to leave the band. Brian agreed. He famously put out a statement saying, "I no longer see eye to eye with the band over the discs we are cutting." And Brian announced a solo career. And 4 days later, the Rolling Stones announced Mick Taylor as their new guitarist.
And almost a month after they fire Brian, the tragic news comes that he's found dead in his swimming pool. And the Stones considered canceling their concert on July 5th of 69 at Hyde Park, but they did move forward with Mick Taylor, and it becomes a memorial to Brian Jones. This book reads like a diary you can't put down. Press reports combined with the previously unpublished firsthand accounts presents the full story. So Tell us about the atmosphere of that Hyde Park show from those who were there.
Well, like you say, the gig had already been announced. It was going to be a Saturday in Hyde Park in London. Summer in London can be fantastic. The weather can be beautiful, and on that day, it was indeed fantastic. There'd been a series of free concerts in Hyde Park, organised by different promoters in the previous couple of years. So the Stones weren't breaking new ground by holding a free concert, but they were building on the knowledge and the experience of the previous free shows. People like Pink Floyd and Traffic had played there. And the Stones show was going to be the biggest yet. There were estimates of over 500,000 people turning up for that gig. But yes, Brian sadly drowned in his swimming pool at home a couple of days before the planned gig. And so the Stones' initial reaction was, well, we have to cancel. And then as they thought about it, they decided to turn it into a tribute to Brian, which they got a little bit of criticism for at the time, because some people thought they should have cancelled it as a mark of respect. But I think they did make the right decision in going ahead, because it gave people the opportunity to come along and pay their own tribute to Brian. Mick famously appeared on stage wearing a Michael Fish dress, read some poetry by Percy Bysshe Shelley as a mark of respect for Brian. And then the Stones played what was their first show with Mick Taylor, their first live music for 2.5 years in front of that crowd.
Elaine Spinks was one of the fans there, and she said Jagger spoke emotionally about the band's loss, then released some doves. You could have heard a pin drop, and then everyone cheered. What a day. Another fan, John Ellis, talks in the book about how the music scene had changed since the Stones went off the road in '67, and how were the Stones adjusting to that in terms of the upcoming tour and what they were going to work on in the studio. This is when he's starting to compose the open G tuning, right?
Yeah. I think Mick and Keith had been to South America and had seen musicians there playing with that tuning, and so Keith had picked something up there. He also worked with Ry Cooder, who had showed him some different ways of tuning the guitar. So they were very much experimenting with what they could do, and that change of approach, if you like, was I suppose the main thing about that was Keith doing something that was Keith led rather than Brian led, because back when they were recording the famous singles we all know about, like Satisfaction, like Ruby Tuesday, like Paint It Black, it was often Brian who was adding those exotic touches. It was Brian who was picking up the sitar. It was Brian who was playing the keyboard. It was Brian who was playing a little bit of flute or a little bit of saxophone on the record. That open tuning that Keith is now famous for was something that Brian had not inspired. Brian had not been involved in. It was Keith taking the lead, very much taking the lead as the musical director of the Stones.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. So this is the period when we're seeing the Stones breaking away from the Beatles, because the Stones are always compared to the Beatles. The press really played that up. The Beatles in '67, as we know, they are now focusing all of their efforts in the studio. They've retired from the road. And like Keith is quoted in the book as saying the Stones are at the core a live band, and they were itching to play again. Is this when we see them starting to break apart from that?
Yes, I mean, the Beatles' last show was Candlestick Park in San Francisco in 1966, and they stopped touring for a variety of reasons, one of which was that inability to replicate on stage the kind of music they wanted to record. I think they were also heartily sick of playing live. They were sick of playing short shows in front of audiences that were screaming and weren't able to listen to the music. And I don't think there was ever an appetite amongst the Beatles to go back out on the road. Of course, they famously played that show on the rooftop of the Apple building in London in January 1969 as a one-off. But the Stones did want to get back out on the road. The Stones had seen other British bands touring America, most famously perhaps Cream, and then Zeppelin had started playing their first American shows. So the Stones knew that there was an audience in America for British bands, and they felt that they could get beyond that teeny bopper band label that they'd had with all those hit singles and go out on the road as a serious act, not playing 30-minute shows, but playing for 60 minutes or 75 minutes. And that's what the US tour became, really. It's a British band creating the template for touring rock bands that people have pretty much followed ever since.
The Beatles' complaint was that nobody was listening to them in concert anymore. It was all screaming. But Charlie Watts has an interesting quote in your book about how in '69 people didn't scream anymore. The music was taken seriously and there was proper amplification. What led to that change? I mean, there's a mention of Zeppelin. Charlie mentioned it. You mentioned that as well. What led to that? Better equipment?
Yeah, some of it was better equipment. Some of it was just the audience growing up. Some of those 14, 15, 16-year-old kids who'd seen the Stones play in the US in 1964, 65, 66 were still fans, but they did want to come along and listen to those newer songs. They weren't there just to scream their heads off. And a lot of them, happy to admit that as well, that, they'd been there in 1964. They were still fans. They accepted that Brian wasn't in the lineup anymore, that the band had matured. They liked Beggar's Banquet. They liked what they were hearing, and they wanted to hear those songs played live. And the other thing about the '69 tour is they played quite a lot of Let It Bleed before the album was released, before it had been played on the radio. So the Stones were debuting a lot of brand new songs, and people wanted to hear them. They wanted to soak them up.
Yeah, clearly the interest in the Stones hadn't waned. 6,000 people stand in line at Madison Square Garden's box office to buy tickets when they go on sale. Both evening performances for the shows, which would be November 27th and 28th, sell out. Opening night, November 7th. So let's start there. Moby Gymnasium in Fort Collins, Colorado, right near Colorado State University. This was not a planned show, and it was a smaller venue. What led them to playing there first?
Yeah, like you say, it wasn't on the initial tour itinerary that had been announced. And I think it was Barry Fay, who was the famous promoter from Denver, Colorado, wanted to get them in, and he made contact with the band and persuaded them of the merits of starting the tour somewhere a bit out of the way where they could mess up if necessary. And you don't want to play your first show in LA or New York where the whole of the media circus is watching you and will see any mistakes you make. So it actually suited the Stones, when they thought about it, to play in Fort Collins. And it was a big gig. It was a big gig for the town because they'd never had anybody of that status play in the area before. And it seemed to have been a great success. The people who were there had a good time. I'm not so sure the college authorities were so keen on it, because there's a little story in the book about the damage that was done to the venue afterwards.
I have them here right in front of me. There's a listing of the damages left behind. This is from Aaron Udell of the Coloradan, which I believe is a local newspaper, right?
Yeah.
193 cigarette burn holes on basketball floor, $2,200. Burned tarp, $3,000. Damaged windows in North Concourse, $262. Damaged glass in 4 entrance doors, $151. 2 broken Kotex machines, $70. Damaged interior tile, $70. Damage to walls in men's restroom requiring sanding and repainting, $28. I mean, the list just goes on. Damaged door jamb. But speaking of cost, the ticket prices, they were, you look at the prices then compared to now, they were between $3 and $8 for most shows. I mean, $7.50 was average top price. That, with inflation, is still $30 to $75 today. But the Stones were criticized for this, weren't they? For charging too much?
They were. And actually, if you go back to the beginning of the Stones as a band back in England in 1963, 1964, they were criticised for charging more, or more properly, local promoters were criticised for charging more. I did another book about the Rolling Stones, the very first years in England, which came out a couple of years ago. And there's a story in there where a promoter would have a band come and play the dance every Tuesday or Wednesday night in this little town in England. And the normal admission price was 4 shillings, which would be about 20 cents at the time. And when the Stones came, prices went up by 50%. So it was suddenly 6 shillings or 30 cents on the night. So accusations that the Rolling Stones have charged too much for tickets go right back to the very beginning of their career. But you're right, the 69 tour saw prices set a little higher than people have been used to paying before. There's a story in the book about somebody saying they went to the Atlanta Pop Festival and got 3 days of music for not much more than they had to pay for one Stones ticket for one performance. So prices went up, but people were still buying the tickets. There was a clamour for tickets. There weren't half empty arenas. So people were going to pay $6, $7, $8 if they had to.
And promoters are seeing that as we move forward and throughout the decades. They realize if people are going to buy the ticket, we're going to keep raising the prices. I mean, until they stop.
Harry Styles has just announced a set of shows. I don't know whether the New York tickets have gone on sale yet, but he's playing 12 nights at Wembley Stadium in London, which is going to be about 850,000 people altogether. And my wife was trying to get tickets for her and her daughter, and you can't get a ticket for less than £350.
Oh.
And those shows are selling out.
Richard Houghton, the author of Is Everybody Ready for the Next Band? The Rolling Stones 1969 US tour. And if anybody's wondering, the hardcore Stones fans know, Is Everybody Ready for the Next Band? That was the introduction by, was it the road manager? Who was the one that would make that announcement?
Yeah, now I can't remember.
Can't remember either.
But say Chipmunk. It wasn't Chipmunk. It's we'll have to fill that in later.
Yeah, if you listen to Get Your Yeah-Yeahs Out, you hear that at the start.
There's a montage of those of several stage introductions.
Let's get to the LA Forum show. Great story from Michael. I think I got it pronounced right. It's spelled IHDE, so I think it's Michael Ide, who said there was a scheduling issue. The LA Kings hockey team was scheduled to play at 1 p.m. The concert would follow 2 hours after the game. They delayed the show by 2.5 hours, right?
That's right. And in fact, there were 2 shows scheduled for that night. So I don't know whether they booked the 5 o'clock show after the hockey game, thinking, well, we can get people out and then get people in for the 5 o'clock show, whether they thought that the hockey team would agree to move their fixture. Hockey team were going nowhere. So, it was basically a hockey game followed by 2 Stones shows all on the same day. And hindsight is a wonderful thing, I know, but chaos ensued.
Yeah, learned the hard way.
Yeah.
And that same fan said, if you listen to the live album from the tour, Get Your Yeah-Yeahs Out, it symbolizes how they sounded at the LA Forum. That album comes from the shows at the Baltimore Civic Center on November 26th. I think it's just 1 song, and 2 shows from Madison Square Garden. Do you agree with that, fan? What are your thoughts on the live album?
I think it's fantastic. You can go on Facebook or anywhere and people are talking about favorite live albums, and there'll be people will slag off every live album. You can nominate an album by, I don't know, AC/DC or Led Zeppelin or Bob Dylan, and somebody will say it's a great album, and somebody else will say, oh, it's a terrible album. There's lots of overdubs and such like. And yes, there are some overdubs on Yah-Yahs, but so many people who gave me stories for the book talked about how that album does capture the spirit of the tour. So I think it's a perfect record.
Yeah, one of my early childhood moments of becoming a classic rock fan is hearing Midnight Rambler on the radio, the live version for the first time. And my older brother had and still has that album, and I was blown away by it. It's one of those moments you don't forget that makes you a fan, and it turned me on to the Stones. Prior to the Baltimore and New York City shows, the band made stops in Oakland, San Diego, Phoenix, Dallas, and Auburn, Texas. One fan, Rick Freeman, said, quote, I remember that the Stones having trouble with airline reservations and their flight had flown away empty from Dallas to Auburn on instructions from an unknown source. Things were not as organized as they are today. What kind of team did the Stones have at that time in comparison to the huge touring juggernaut machine that they would become in the 80s and 90s and beyond?
Well, their road manager was a guy called Sam Cutler, and it's Sam who does those vocal introductions on Yah-Yahs that we hear for those
That's
famous
the one.
opening
Okay.
words. And yeah, it was a pretty small team. You know, there was, like you say, now a Stones tour is a mammoth operation, not least because they often have two stage crews. So they're setting up at one venue, how else they're taking down the stage at somewhere else. So there'll be two sets of wagons on the road, two sets of speakers, two sets of lighting systems, etc. And then the band's personal crew, guitar techs and such like, just follow the band around. But back then, a lot of what they used was the venue's own backline. The PA was supplied by the venue. Obviously, lighting shows weren't anything like as elaborate as they are now. The Stones did have their own lighting, but it was nothing like as elaborate. So Chip Monk, who worked on that tour, did the lighting, I think, for the show. But whilst it might seem quite crude to modernize, it was quite something back in 1969.
More shows to come. They head to Champaign, Illinois, Chicago. There was a November 23rd appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, New York City, then on to Detroit and Philadelphia. Fan Anthony Zumpano said, quote, Mick was in his Uncle Sam hat and charged into Jumpin' Jack Flash. And he later adds, quote, I was transformed as I had just witnessed the greatest rock and roll band in the world. Dave Dartnell said, quote, a good friend of mine said there was no barrier between the seats and the stage, and he got up front and had his hands on the stage, and Mick danced on his fingers. He said it hurt, but he didn't care. That's also a big difference between that tour and future Stones tours. The audience is closer to the band, which is, now after the Altamont, that changed, right? I mean, you couldn't get that close to the Stones.
No, I went to see the Rolling Stones play in Stockholm, Sweden in 2014 on their On Fire tour, they called it. I paid top dollar and I managed to get on the front row on the barrier. But yeah, we were 20 feet from the stage. My son was with me. There were security guards stood in front of us. And even if Mick had reached out with his hand, we would not be able to shake hands with him because the band were that far back, which was a good thing as it turned out, because they had pyro for Sympathy for the Devil and you could feel the flames on your face. So if we'd been much closer, I maybe would have got my beard singed off.
Yeah. Mick's stage presence had a change at that point as opposed to previous tours. Was he making adjustments in how he approached the shows in comparison to previous tours? Because again, times were changing, right? We're into the late 60s now.
Yeah, I think that the whole act was a bit more polished, a bit more professional. There was more thought given to it. As we were talking about earlier, those very early shows were just screamathons where the band could not hear themselves play, where they were just almost exchanging glances with each other, thinking, well, how are we going to get through the next 30 minutes? And there were stage invasions. Mick would be wrestled to the ground by over-enthusiastic fans, male and female, climbing onto the stage. There's famous footage of him playing with the band at the Royal Albert Hall in London, where he's half rugby tackled by a girl trying to grab him, and the security are trying to wrestle the girl away. So you're on stage in 1966, 67, wondering what's going to happen next. By 1969, we have got that more respectful audience, wants to get into the groove, wants to hear the music, wants to enjoy the show. And so Mick's able to be a bit more theatrical. He's got the belt, which he's using on Midnight Rambler, where he drops to his knees and hits the stage with the belt in time to the music. So there's more planning, more forethought about the show, and ties in with the lyrics, ties in with the theme of the music to give a more rounded show.
Hey guys, we'll get back to the show, but first I want to tell you about an exclusive deal for Booked on Rock listeners. Get 15% off any purchase at oldglory.com. Over 300,000 officially licensed items covering music, sports, entertainment, and pop culture. Merchandise featuring legendary music artists like Bob Marley, The Beatles, Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and many, many more. Go to oldglory.com. Make sure to use the promo code BookedOnRock. Also find a link in this episode's show notes, or just go to bookedonrock.com and click on My Deals. They performed at Baltimore Civic Center on November 26th, Thanksgiving Eve. Just one song, Love in Vain, that ended up on that live album. What led to that decision is just that one song? It's just one that they really liked so much they had to put it on there?
Well, they taped a number of shows on the tour, and the band's initial intention was that the live, well, I don't think it was actually an initial intention to release a live album at all, but famously, the Madison Square Garden shows got bootlegged and released as an album called Liver Than You'll Ever Be. And that, along with a Dylan album, were selling in their thousands and tens of thousands. So I think the Stones and their record label realized that there was revenue being lost there. There was a market there for a live album. So the Stones said, well, let's put out the whole show on a double album, and let's put out some of the songs that the support acts on the tour performed as well. So the original vision was that Ya-Ya's would be a double album with tracks from Ike and Tina Turner and B.B. King as, you know, as one of the sides on the album.
Terry Reid as well, was he to be on that?
And Terry Reid, yes. It was going to be, you know, it was going to introduce the world to those arguably lesser known acts. Decca in England, who were the Stones record label, said no to that idea. You couldn't fit the whole Stones live set onto a single album, so some tracks were cut out. Satisfaction didn't make the final cut on Ya-Ya's. Prodigal Son, which was a track off Beggar's Banquet, which was a slow song they played, didn't make it on. I'm Free, you know, one of the few of their older songs that they played, didn't make it to the final cut. Those tracks all later emerged on the re-released Ya-Ya's that came out many years later, but it wasn't what was on Ya-Ya's when it first came out in 1970.
But that one track, Love in Vain from Baltimore, just one that they preferred, they liked it.
Yeah, I mean, it's, if you hear some of the alternate takes, that's such a, I mean, it's a beautiful song. And obviously their interpretation of that old Robert Johnson number was introducing so many people to a legendary blues guitarist that so few people had heard of at the time. And I actually think it really encapsulates what the Stones were all about. They performed it on Let It Bleed, but the live version is just that little bit more special.
Let's get into the New York City shows now. There's a quote from Keith in the book: the band wouldn't allow all the seats to be sold. What was the reason for that decision?
I think it was that a full house at Madison Square Garden could be over 20,000 people. And Keith was concerned about playing to such an enormous crowd and wanting to keep it as intimate as possible. So they didn't sell maybe 5,000-6,000 tickets to each show that they could have sold in order to try and keep it more intimate and create a better atmosphere for the show. Obviously, in later years, financial considerations take over how many seats get sold, and the Stones went on to play football stadiums, and again, pioneers really of that. Before the late 70s, the 1978 tour that the Stones did, the Some Girls tour, they started playing big outdoor shows across the US, which nobody had ever really done before. And they replicated that in 1982 in Europe when they played in Wembley Stadium in England, big outdoor football stadium, and they played in places across Europe. So the size of the crowd meant you had to have a bigger show, more stage effects, more lights, more pyro, inflatables, as the Stones famously started using later in their career as well. But back in 1969, it was still very much about the music, about watching the band, seeing the band, enjoying the music. And I think that's where Keith drew the line and said, we don't want to be playing to too many people because it will detract from what we're trying to do.
Here's a small world story. My sister's boyfriend installs pools here in Connecticut, here in the US. And she texts me. She says, "Hey, Eric, Cody is installing the pool of Keith Richards." I said, "Get out of here," because he lives in, I think, Wilton, Connecticut, I think it is. So I said, "Did he get to meet him?" You know, she said, "Yeah, he is a super nice guy." And it just puts into this perspective of like, here's a guy who's played in front of these giant audiences and these, you know, just huge stadiums. And he's just a regular guy. From all the stories that I've heard about him, he's just a regular, everyday guy. I've heard stories of him, you know, people that lived in the area that would see him coming to the local school, you know, where his kids would go to school, and he'd show up at the plays and everything. And it's a reminder that these are just regular humans, but you know, it's Keith Richards, you know. I'd be like, oh my God, I'm installing the pool of Keith Richards. It's just pretty cool. I thought that was.
I've heard a similar story. When I was researching another book about the Stones, a guy rang me up. Used to know, I think he went to school with Keith, so you know, this guy in his 70s, and he said, you know, the whole rock star thing Keith does, that's an act he puts on in public. You know, if you're alone with him privately, or you go around to his house, he's just a normal guy, and he'll make you a sandwich, you know, and there's no airs and graces about him whatsoever. Just absolutely, you know, feet on the ground, dead normal guy.
It's what we love about Keith.
Rock world.
Yeah, we love that about Keith. Yeah. Yeah. So Ike and Tina Turner, B.B. King, Terry Reid, they opened the shows at Madison Square Garden, the first on Thanksgiving night. And one fan talks about how seeing one of these shows on YouTube is great, but it doesn't capture the energy of being in that building. Any stories that stand out to you about the comments that you get from fans who were at those shows in New York City?
I think it's just that whole sense of occasion. You know, I'm sure many of your listeners have been to gigs and come away afterwards and thinking, that was unbelievable. I didn't think it was going to be like that. It's that sense of expectation sometimes before a band comes on. You know, the band's going to come on in the next 5, 10, 15 minutes. You're waiting. You know, the lights haven't gone down. They're still playing the music. People are still going to the bar and buying a beer, or people are chatting. And then the lights do go down. And it's that sense of, well, what's going to happen next? You can't beat that. You can't capture that on film. You know, I mean, there's been lots of great footage shot of the Stones, but there's nothing like being in the room, being in the venue when it happens and hearing that famous announcement.
It is very true. And there are comments like that. If it's people saying it felt like an eternity between the time the last artist goes on and the Stones go on. The excitement is in the room. And when the first song kicks in and you see that band, there's nothing like it, and you can't capture that on YouTube. The highlight from that tour, and I mentioned it before, is Midnight Rambler. Mick is quoted in the book saying he and Keith wrote that song on holiday in Italy, in Positano, a beautiful hill town. He said, quote, "Why we should write such a dark song in this beautiful sunny place, I really don't know. We wrote everything there. The tempo changes, everything. I'm playing the harmonica in these little cafes, and there's Keith with the guitar." That is a great story, just to picture them writing this amazing song. And it was a part of a set list of around 15 songs. What was the average set list each night? I mean, did they spread it out, or was it mostly new? I think you said they threw in a few of the older hits, right?
So they were drawing very heavily on Beggars Banquet and Let It Bleed. They were playing I'm Free, as I talked about before. Didn't make yayas, but it was a song that, you know, they played to American audiences. They would often finish with Satisfaction. But other than Prodigal Son and Love in Vain, which of course were both cover versions of old blues numbers, most of the rest of the material they were playing was stuff they'd written in the last 18 months, 2 years. Some of that, I guess, was a conscious, we want to leave the Brian Jones years behind us kind of decision. Some of it was the fact that they had Mick Taylor on guitar, and Mick had been involved in the recording of the Let It Bleed material, so they were songs that he'd helped work out and arrange. And some of it was about being able to escape the 3-minute confines of a pop song. So you could play Gimme Shelter, you could play Midnight Rambler, songs that go on for 7, 8, 10 minutes and expand them. So if you want to do another 12, 24 bars, you can do that and take the song into that longer format and make it work.
Any personal favorites for you?
Well, I think Midnight Rambler. I mean, Midnight Rambler, I saw them when they came back in 2012 and they played 2 shows at the O2 Arena in London. And Mick Taylor guested on that lineup on that tour, because they did 2 tours in the UK and then they came and did 2 tours, 2 gig show. Sorry, they did 2 gigs in New York, and Mick Taylor played on all those shows. And Midnight Rambler really worked well. It was taking you back to 1969 again, with Keith and Mick and Mick Taylor all working out. You know, Ronnie would sort of step back into the shadows a little bit and let those guys just take the floor.
Here is a set list. So just pulling it up quickly here from one of the Madison Square Garden shows. 15 songs: Jumpin' Jack Flash, Carol, the Chuck Berry cover, Sympathy for the Devil, Stray Cat Blues, Love in Vain, Prodigal Son, You Gotta Move, Under My Thumb, I'm Free, Midnight Rambler, Live With Me, Little Queenie, a Chuck Berry cover, Can't Get No Satisfaction, Honky Tonk Woman, and they finish with Street Fighting Man. That's a set list right there.
Certainly is. And of course, if you go and see the Stones now, well, maybe not now, because maybe they've stopped touring, although I hope that's not the case. But if you went and saw them in the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of those numbers would still be in the set list, which is a sign of what great songs they are and how loved they are by the band. Some people who go and see the Stones in recent years will complain about what are called the old war horses being dragged out time and time again. But Midnight Rambler, for example, stands a test of time. It's a great song. It's a showstopper. That's why it's still in the set. That's why they still play it. And that's why people still want to hear it.
The Stones followed with 2 shows in Boston at the Boston Garden, then a performance in Jupiter, Florida, November 30th at the Palm Beach International Raceway. And that leads us to December 6, 1969, Altamont Speedway, the dark flip side of the Summer of Love. The Hells Angels crashed with concertgoers. Meredith Hunter, an 18-year-old attendee, was seen pulling a gun near the front of the stage. Hells Angel Alan Pissarro stabbed Hunter multiple times and killing him. Now you get the stories in the book here that really give you an idea of the atmosphere and what went down that night. One talks about how LSD was everywhere. This is Joe Pruss. He was right there up front, but eventually managed to get the hell out of there. He left that area. The general consensus is that people really could sense that things were going in the wrong direction and the anxiety kept building.
Yeah, I mean, again, hindsight is a wonderful thing. But I think now we can all recognize that trying to organize a show in less than 72 hours, I think it was, by the time they fixed on the Altamont location, was absolutely crazy. Weeks, months of planning goes into putting on a big show now. And the idea that it could be set up and that it would run smoothly when they were building a stage literally from scratch, when there were no facilities in the area, just seems absolutely nuts now. And the death of Meredith Hunter was clearly a tragedy, but in some ways it's a miracle that there weren't more people hurt or seriously injured as a result of trying to put on a show at such short notice with a lack of proper facilities for people. I mean, ironically, there's a story in the book where one person said they enjoyed the show, they went home, they didn't see any trouble. But clearly the people who've given me stories for the book don't remember it that way. You know, there were lots of people who'd done a lot of acid who were clearly not well. It got really cold because the Bay Area was further north than LA, and people who were coming up from LA hadn't necessarily expected the weather to be like that. So it sounds like it was pretty miserable. I mean, I would have loved to have seen the Stones on that tour in 1969, but I'm really glad I wasn't at Altamont.
Yeah, one fan, James Pagliassati, talks in the book about the intimacy of those shows, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And that's something that would change. He said, quote, the stage was raised, obviously, but not very high. And actually, there were people with their elbows on the stage while the Stones were performing. It was that intimate. And even though they were starting to play to much larger crowds, there was still that intimacy. That really changed in 72. That's the quote from James Pagliasati. And again, I would think that the Altamont concert would lead to those changes in the future, drastic changes in security and the way things were going to be set up, right? From that point forward.
Yeah, there's the infamous story about the Hells Angels apparently taking a contract out on Mick Jagger because Mick blamed the Angels for the security or lack of security at the show. And some of this goes back to the Hyde Park show in London back in July, where the Hells Angels in England provided some sort of informal security for the London show. But people made the point that the Angels in the US were not the kind of nice guys that the Angels in England were. So in England, they were just a bunch of guys who had motorbikes and drank a lot of beer and wore leather jackets, pretty much. Whereas in the US, they were much more of a gang. There was more criminality involved, and these guys were not to be messed with. So the Stones version of events was that the Grateful Dead suggested that the Angels could provide security. And this is one of the products of trying to put a show together in 72 hours. Nobody gave much thought to it. Nobody thought there'd be real issues. So letting the Angels run the show seemed like a good idea and a quick fix. Nobody actually thought, well, what are the downsides to that? So when Mick blamed the Angels for what happened at Altamont, and then this rumoured contract was taken out on Mick, Mick allegedly never stood still on stage after that because he was always worried about being shot at.
Wow. Yeah, he was spooked. Now, there was a Hell's Angel, and it's in the book. Years later, maybe sometime in the 80s, came up to him and said that was not true. There was no hit on you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let's be clear. If you're a public figure who lives in the spotlight and you're Mick Jagger or you're Paul McCartney, it must be really, really difficult. If you step out the door every day thinking, well, everybody knows who I am, that means there's some crazy people out there. You know, when John Lennon was shot, that must have been so difficult for everybody who had a similar level of fame, because they suddenly realized that could have been them and it could still be them. So you've got to, and I don't know how you do it, but you've got to put all that kind of stuff aside and just try and get on with your life. But I'm sure for Mick and lots of people in the public eye, it meant they had to look again at their security arrangements, and can they ever step out the front door and walk to the shops and buy a pint of milk? Maybe not, or maybe not without a bodyguard.
The Book Down Rock podcast is part of the Boneless Podcasting Network. If you're a fan of classic rock and classic film like I am, go to boneless.lovable.app to find over 20 great shows there. That's boneless.lovable.app, or just go to bookdownrock.com, click on the logo. It'll take you right to the Boneless Podcasting Network. It is what you want it to be. Listen with confidence. You write in the afterward quote that the 1969 tour of the United States now forms a significant part of the Rolling Stones legend is indisputable. Altamont capped off a tumultuous year that included Brian Jones' dismissal, Mick Taylor joining the band, Brian's death, the Hyde Park show, and Marianne Faithfull's suicide attempt whilst in Australia with Mick Jagger. But you also know that this tour also set the template for how rock bands would tour in the future. So talk about that. We'll finish with that and what impact this tour had, in your opinion.
Well, if we leave Altamont out of it, because that was an aberration in terms of the way it worked out, the rest of the tour was properly planned. It sold out. You know, you couldn't get a ticket. There was a clamour for tickets. The Madison Square Garden shows were massively oversubscribed in terms of people trying to get hold of tickets. So the tour was a success. The band, you know, played those numbers live. The shows all went well. And if they'd gone home after the West Palm Beach show, we wouldn't be talking about Altamont. We'd be talking about what a roaring success the 1969 tour was. Clearly, come 1972, when the Stones came back to play North America for the first time, they'd learnt things in 1969, and some of the things they'd learnt were put into practice in 1972. They played some of the same cities. They played some different places because they wanted to play off the beaten track a little bit. And they made more money. Ticket prices went up again. The tour grosses went up. The clamour for tickets went up. And 1969 attracted lots of headlines. 1972 was a bigger show again and a bigger success again. And everybody from coming over from Britain to play learned from what the Stones learned from those 69 and 72 tours in terms of where to play, what kind of cities to choose. And it's still true today. You know, British bands often play the East Coast, they'll play Chicago, they'll come down the West Coast. And there are large swathes of the US where a British touring band wouldn't necessarily think to play because they see the big markets as being the Eastern Seaboard, the Pacific Coast, and the places like Cleveland and Chicago.
Really set the template for what was to come.
Yeah. I mean, I've done a book on the Faces, and the Faces famously were selling out cities like Detroit in 1969, 1970 after Rod Stewart joined the band, and they started out as Small Faces before rebranding as Faces. In England, they were still playing pub gigs. You know, they couldn't get arrested in England, and they're playing 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 seater venues in the US, and coming back 2 weeks later and playing again because people wanted to hear them play. So they learned some of the stuff that the Stones had found out from their touring shows. And as we talked about, Zeppelin did the same. Jethro Tull did the same. You know, bands that found an audience in the US found those audiences mainly around the big cities in the north of the country.
So let's talk about the book when it comes out. Is everybody ready for the next band, the Rolling Stones 1969 US tour? February 24th is the release date?
It should be February, but the books are actually on a ship crossing the Atlantic as we speak. So it's probably going to be around the end of March because the books have to get to the warehouse and then be shipped out to local bookstores. But you can order it from your local bookstore if you are in the US or Canada.
Okay.
And your bookstore can order it in.
Yeah, it's available online, Amazon, all the usual outlets. Yeah. I see it there as well. So, all right, that's great. And can people find you online, Richard? Yeah,
they can. My company's called Spenwood Books. So if they want to check me out, I'm at spenwoodbooks.com. I'm also on Facebook. I have an author page called Richard Houghton Author. So if you look that up on Facebook, you might find me there. I blog a little bit about music stuff, you know, going to a local thrift store and buying an album and thinking, why didn't I buy this album when it came out in 1976 or whatever it might be.
Right.
Or complaining about the price of tickets or reviewing a show I've just been to see, you know, all those kinds of things.
And thank you for setting up the interview with Bruce Pegg. We had him on to talk about the ELP book, which is done very well. People are really enjoying the episode and they're going out and getting that book, which they should.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That book is available in the US now. It's called Welcome Back, My Friend, A People's History of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. It's endorsed by the band book. And it's got some great photos in there too from a guy called Neil Preston who photographed ELP in the very early days, went on to photograph Zeppelin a bunch of times. And he also kindly, you know, gave me an interview for the book as well.
Richard Houghton, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Eric, thank you.
That's it. It's in the books.